programs randomly like this, but I'm actually making this show in response to a question which one of my viewers asked me. Peter Lamont in Inverness, and you know who you are, was asking me why I believe the Scottish Government has largely ignored both the Scottish Sovereignty Research Group's recent conference, basically not even responded to the invitation to attend it, to even talk about it. They seem to also have not reacted in any way at all, not even acknowledging it in any way. The absolutely epoch-making speech made by Professor Robert Black, the highest legal mind in Scotland, as a King's Counsel, who said quite openly that up until recently he'd accepted the United Kingdom's narrative that Scotland had joined the Union voluntarily, but he's now changed his mind, and he said, having reviewed the history presented to him by Salvo of what happened to Scotland and England after the signature was dry on the Treaty of Union in 1707, was that Scotland was extinguished as a country, and all of its institutions were either permanently altered or were destroyed. But then he looked at what happened to England. Now, according to the English narrative on this, both Scotland and England, as independent countries, were supposed to have been extinguished, and new legislation was supposed to be enacted, creating the new United Kingdom. However, the history proves that that never happened. And Professor Black has finally been the first, I think, King's Counsel in Scotland to acknowledge that Scotland isn't in a union. The union never actually happened. We're not bound by its rules or anything else, and that we are in fact a non-self-governing colony or non-self-governing territory of the United Kingdom, in the same way that places like Jamaica or the Bahamas or India or formerly Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, were also colonies of the United Kingdom. Now, why would a party which at its core and at its inception existed primarily to promote and achieve independence ignore something as important as this? I think it's a very valid question. Now, I can't get inside the mind of the ministers in the Scottish Government. The SNP ministers are the ones who would decide about whether or not to react to this. But also, I think the Scottish National Party itself, the SNP itself, as a body and as a member-led organisation, could also have taken a decision to send some representatives. Every SNP MSP was invited to this event, the SSRG conference in Dunfermline about 2 weeks ago, where all this happened, and yet nothing was ever heard from them. There was no acknowledgement even of having received the invitations. So why does a government, ostensibly peopled by a party which is supposedly looking for independence, why would they ignore something as vitally important as this? I can only speculate, but I think there are several reasons why a party in government might choose to ignore something as vital as this. And I suspect that these fall into two broad categories. One of them is, I think you could probably say, is a human factor. If you're an MSP, or indeed if you're a Scottish minister, you've been elected, and you're working, representing your constituents in Holyrood either as an MSP or as a minister, then you have that position for, I think it's 5 years, right? So it's not a very long sinecure that you have. You've got 5 years or so of a pretty good salary, to be fair. I mean, something like between 64 and 84,000 pounds a year, which is, in anybody's book, is probably about 2 or 3 times the average salary of your average Scottish worker. So they're pretty well recompensed. And the most obvious human factor in this would be fear of losing your job. So if Scotland did finally start its process of decolonisation, then those very same MSPs and those government ministers, if they're elected again in 2026, would then have to deal with the United Kingdom government and negotiate this decolonisation process, because once it starts and the UN mandates it, the UN member concerned, that which would be the United Kingdom, is duty bound then to take action and to actually begin the process of negotiating the various steps towards independence with the administration of Scotland. And I'm saying the word administration because I would argue that Holyrood isn't a government, despite the name. It is an administration. It's the administrative arm of the United Kingdom government in Scotland, running Scotland on behalf of Westminster. And of course, it's peopled by members of the SNP, which is ostensibly a pro-independence party. So why ignore this? So it might be just the fear that either they might lose their jobs if they back this, or there's maybe a fear that they might be punished by their own leaders. John Swinney might eject you from as a minister for having the barefaced cheek to go behind his back to a conference and listening to what was happening, or even, God forbid, supporting the ideas that came out of it. So there's that. There are those fears, the fear of basically being punished by the leader of your own party or the leader of your government, the fear of perhaps losing your job, and also the abject fear of having to negotiate with the United Kingdom government after the decolonisation process begins. But that's the best case scenario. That's if you take the SNP administration as a group of human beings who have their own self-interest to look after. I mean, everybody does. I'm not saying that's something that people don't do. You want to protect your income, you want to protect your job, and that's understandable. And you don't want to get into trouble with the boss. But that's just putting a good spin on it, and that is a possibility that people thought, I'd quite like to go, but I dare not do this because I don't want to upset my boss. Fair enough? Maybe. Okay, that might be one potential explanation for why this has happened. Now, I would also like to point out, just at this moment, that there were three things that happened which the SNP administration in Holyrood has completely ignored. One was the fact that the conference was taking place at all. They've ignored the invitations that were sent out, and there were many of them. Every SNP MSP was invited to come along and to chat about what was transpiring and what was being discussed and what was being said. And they could have participated, and they should have participated. As the party of government and as the party of Scottish independence, they ought to have had probably the biggest representation of anybody at that event, and yet they just weren't there. Okay, so there is that. The other thing they ignored, apart from this invitation, were two things. And one, I think, is probably of the most historical importance at the moment, and probably the biggest shock of all, was Scotland's senior legal counsel. And this is Professor Robert Black, KC now, right? King's Counsel. This man is the most senior legal expert in Scotland. And he publicly changed his opinion of Scotland's constitutional situation from being part of a voluntary union, which he had accepted all of his working life until last year, when he finally saw the historical evidence of what actually happened after the Treaty of Union had been signed. And then he said, after he saw that, he realised that the union had actually never come into effect in the first place, and it was in fact just a fiction. England continued to exist. The English government remained unchanged, its parliament unchanged, its location unchanged, its monarchy unchanged. It made no effort to extinguish itself whatsoever, as they said they would, and it did not introduce legislation to create a new United Kingdom state. It just rebadged itself, i.e. England, the Kingdom of England, as the United Kingdom, or in fact at the time calling it Great Britain. And that was uniting supposedly Scotland and England together in an equal union, when in actual fact they simply added Scottish territory and all of Scotland's resources and all of its people to England as an extra bit of England, but calling it Great Britain. So because Robert Black said this, he then went on to say that decolonisation was now the most suitable route for Scotland to seek its justifiable reclaiming of its own independence. And remember, that because Scotland isn't part of a union, it's not been ratified in any way, shape or form in Westminster, technically we don't really need to become independent of anything. But in order for this to be recognised widely, he also said and acknowledged that Scotland would need to go to the UN and request being added to the list of nations for decolonisation. Now, currently the list is about 17 countries. If Scotland becomes the 18th country, then obviously it's a bit further down the queue. But on the other hand, Scotland has all the ingredients necessary to meet the criterion for being a non-self-governing territory. A territory which has a small amount of autonomy, but in which the major decision-making about overseas trade, foreign relations, defence, and so many other things are actually controlled by a parliament in another country. So that was very important. Robert Black's opinion was earth-shattering because it's the first legal opinion from a KC, and in this case, the top KC in Scotland, the highest legal expert opinion in the country, to come out and say this was really world-shattering. Now, I'd mentioned already in previous broadcasts the Scottish Sovereignty Research Group and Salvo, and particularly Salvo and its efforts to actually initiate the process of decolonisation by presenting a huge dossier of historical facts, which incidentally the English state does not dispute. They can't dispute them because they wrote the history themselves. The winners always end up writing the history. And the history books show that Scotland wasn't actually accepted into any kind of union at all. It was just added to England's crown and became part of Greater England as Great Britain. But because of all of this, Salvo, having presented this in a document, which is now going to the Secretary General of the United Nations in New York, and it is being presented by a non-government organisation, a human rights legal practice in Europe, and their representative is going to present this to Antonio Guterres at the United Nations. Now, this is also a huge deal, and it's the kind of thing that you would have expected the Party of Independence to be jumping up and down with delight and saying, fantastic, we really want to back this. We want to include this in our policy. And yet, tumbleweeds rolled across in front of us. There was nothing, no word, radio silence from the SNP administration for some reason, and we still don't know why. The other speculation I have for the reason why, and nobody's going to like me saying this, is that our government, our Scottish government in inverted commas, but the administration which runs our country at the moment, is peopled by politicians who are largely obeying the British influence coming from Westminster. John Swinney has said, and Norrie Hunter echoed this in a recent programme on Hodmajaket, he said that the Scottish Government would work constructively with the United Kingdom Government, all sorts of new issues, and collaborate and all the rest of it. It was all terribly friendly and polite, and the Scottish Government was going to work with Westminster. Now, forgive me for saying this, but when you're a government which espouses full independence from another state, you don't work with that state. You don't happily go to meetings with their ministers and discuss important matters of national importance unless you've accepted their narrative. And that's the only explanation I can think of which actually makes sense in this case. I know that there are thousands of SNP members who are desperate for independence and would never countenance this kind of activity or this kind of attitude, and are probably just as baffled, frustrated and angry as the rest of us. And so I'm not bashing the SNP as a party, but I'm certainly not going to pull my punches when I talk about John Swinney or Kate Forbes or any of the other Scottish ministers. Mike Russell, for example, what the hell is he thinking? Mike Russell is the minister in charge of constitutional affairs. And here is a massive piece of news about the Constitution of Scotland, and he said nothing about it. Not a word. He knows about it. He has to know about it. It's appeared all over the social media network. And yet nothing, not a whisper, has come from Michael Russell. So the only explanation for this is they are doing what the British state does. When any mention of the potential of Scotland to free itself from the Union is made public, and that to blanket. They give it no media coverage. They don't reply to letters. They don't reply to invitations. They pretend like it's not happening so that they can say, la, 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 I'm not listening, and we get nothing. We get no response whatsoever, just complete silence. And I'll bet you any money, if I were to say right now, Michael Russell, if you're watching this program, get in touch with me and let me know why you never replied to the invitation to attend the Scottish Sovereignty Research Group's recent conference. Also, tell me why you never responded to Professor Black KC's massive legal opinion that Scotland is not in a union. You're the constitutional minister, for goodness sake. You should be responding to that straight away with joy, accepting it as the new reality, the reality that's been concealed from us. All of these things you should be doing, Michael. Why are you not doing them? You're in the twilight years of your political career. You've got nothing to lose by accepting this. Even if you were to lose your job, after 2026, you could retire happily. There is no risk in this for you. There is only good news for the people of Scotland. So why are you not doing something about it? And as I say, we can only speculate about this. But John Swinney, Kate Forbes, and Michael Russell certainly, and maybe many other Scottish ministers, seem to be under strict instructions not to respond to this at all, to pretend that it's not happening and to act as if they haven't heard about it. That to me is shocking. It's disgraceful. It is a colossal betrayal of every SNP activist and member and every SNP voter, and I include myself in that number. I voted SNP for decades because I trusted the party to work towards independence. But when I see them not responding to something as momentous and historic as these events, I am convinced now that there is something badly wrong with our Scottish SNP government. And it's something that could only be fixed, probably by replacing them. At least replacing the SNP's parliamentary leadership with a new group who do accept the new political realities, the legal and lawful realities, and the process which has been begun not by our politicians, not by our leaders, but by experts in their own fields, professors, doctors, top journalists, and even now a British diplomat or an ex-British diplomat in Craig Murray who endorses this, sees the legality and the lawfulness of this new reality, and he fully supports it. Why does nobody else? Anyway, let me leave you with those thoughts. If you're as angry as I am, then leave some comments in the comment section of this program. And if you still want myself and Norrie Hunter, who's my partner on Hod Majakit, to keep broadcasting, please make a donation to the Inde-Car donation line. It's you'll find it under Partick Driver. That's my handle usually on X. And if you want to make a donation, please do so. And it is keeping me afloat. And I'd like to thank the many dedicated donors I already have who've been keeping me afloat just over the last few weeks, but it could do with a bit more for some little bit of comfort, because it's difficult enough when you're self-employed to make time to do broadcasts like this. Anyway, I'll leave you with those thoughts. As I always say, keep the faith, but I've lost my faith in the SNP government at the moment, and I think it's time something changed to get that trust back. And so long as they keep pretending that the political reality hasn't shifted, nobody is going to have any respect for them at all, or trust. And I feel very sorry for all my friends in the SNP party at the moment watching on in dismay while this blanket silence emanating from the SNP's parliamentary group goes on. I'll see you soon. Bye bye for now.